At some point, the idea of finishing falls apart. Not because you reached the end, not because you completed something, but because there was never a finish line to begin with. For a long time, life was organized around arrival. Arriving at clarity, arriving at stability, arriving at the right version of yourself, arriving at peace. Even when you weren't consciously chasing those things, they were there in the background, shaping effort, shaping reflection, shaping how each phase was interpreted. Every stage pointed forward. This was preparation for what came next. This confusion would eventually resolve. This quiet would eventually turn into something else. But here, that forward pull has softened. Not because you gave up, because there's nowhere you're supposed to arrive. You're already here. And here isn't a destination. It's just where life is happening. That realization doesn't land as relief. It lands as neutrality. There's no rush of freedom, no sense of triumph, just the quiet recognition that nothing is waiting to be completed. That can feel unsettling at first, because the idea of a finish line gave structure. It gave purpose to effort. It justified discomfort. It made uncertainty tolerable. If you knew this was leading somewhere, you could endure it. But when the finish line disappears, endurance changes shape. You're no longer enduring for something. You're just living. And living doesn't move toward completion. It moves forward because time moves forward. This is often where people expect a sense of loss, like something meaningful has been taken away. But what actually leaves is pressure. The pressure to arrive. The pressure to get it right. The pressure to stabilize into a final form. Without that pressure, life becomes strangely workable. You're not trying to resolve yourself. You're not trying to settle into a permanent understanding. You're not trying to reach a state where questions stop appearing. Questions may still appear. They just don't imply failure. They don't suggest you're behind. They don't mean you missed something. They're just thoughts passing through a living system. And because there's no finish line, they don't carry urgency. You don't need to answer them. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to use them to redirect your life. You let them pass. That's what changes. Not the presence of thought, the authority it holds. For a long time, thought acted like a guide. It evaluated where you were. It suggested where you should go next. It measured progress. Here, that measuring falls away. Not because you stopped thinking, because thinking no longer has a goal to measure against. There's no endpoint to compare yourself to, so the calculations stop. And when calculations stop, effort changes. You still put effort into things. You still care. You still try. But you're not trying to arrive. You're responding. That's a different posture. Trying to arrive creates tension. Responding creates movement. Movement doesn't need completion. It just continues until it changes. That's why this phase doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a continuation without a map. And that can feel strange if maps once gave you safety. If knowing where you were going helped you tolerate where you were. Here, you don't know where this leads. Not because you're lost, because there's no lead to. Life doesn't resolve into a final state. It keeps rearranging. And rearrangement doesn't need a conclusion. You might notice that you're less interested in defining where you are. You don't say, I'm in this phase now. You don't label yourself as integrated, healed, awakened, or settled. Those labels imply completion. They imply you crossed a line. Here, there's no line to cross, so the labels don't stick. You're just here. And here keeps changing. That change doesn't feel threatening anymore, because there's no ideal state you're trying to preserve. You don't have to protect a realization. You don't have to maintain a level of awareness. You don't have to hold on to how things feel right now. Things will shift. And that's not regression. It's life. For a long time, regression was something to fear. It meant going backward, losing progress, undoing work. But regression only exists when there's a forward direction, when there's a ladder, when there's a finish line at the top. Without that structure, movement doesn't collapse into progress or regression. It's just change. Some days feel open. Some days feel heavy. Some days feel quiet. Some days feel chaotic. None of that means you're doing something wrong. None of it means you fell off the path. There is no path. That's not nihilism. The simplicity. You still have responsibilities. You still make decisions. You still deal with consequences. But those things don't exist to move you toward a final version of yourself. They exist because life is happening, and you're part of it. This is often where people expect a sense of, what now? What do I do with this? How do I live from here? What's the next step? But those questions assume a program. They assume this is leading somewhere else. It's not. This is just living without a projected endpoint. And living without a projected endpoint feels different. There's less urgency, less pressure to optimize, less sense that time is slipping away. You're not trying to get somewhere before it's too late. You're just responding to what's in front of you. That doesn't mean time stops mattering. It means time isn't being compared to an imagined future. So it doesn't feel like it's running out. It feels like it's being used. Used doesn't mean productive. It means inhabited. You're here for the moments as they happen. Not storing them, not evaluating them, not measuring them against a standard, just living them. That's why this season ends the way it does. Not with resolution, but with the absence of one. Because resolution implies a problem that needed solving. And what you may have noticed is that nothing was actually broken. Life didn't need fixing. It didn't need to be completed. It just needed space to function without interference. And now it's doing that. Quietly, ordinarily, you might notice that future thinking still appears. Plans still form. Ideas still arise. Concerns still show up. But they don't organize your identity. They don't define the size of your life. They're practical considerations, not existential ones. You plan because planning is useful, not because the future holds a better version of you. You think ahead because coordination helps, not because arrival is required. That's a big shift, because it removes the emotional weight from the future. The future becomes another set of moments, not a solution, not a destination, not a place where everything finally makes sense. That expectation dissolves. And when it dissolves, the present stops being a waiting room. You're not passing time, you're living in it. This is also where the idea of integration finally falls away. Not because integration failed, because it finished without ceremony. Life absorbed what needed absorbing. There's nothing left to do with it. No maintenance required. No final adjustment. You're not carrying something forward. You're not protecting an insight. You're not stabilizing a realization. You're just living. And living doesn't need to be integrated. It's already happening. This can feel anticlimactic, especially if you expected awareness to lead somewhere extraordinary. But ordinary life is extraordinary in a different way. Not because it's intense, because it's stable, because it continues. Because it doesn't require you to be someone special. You don't have to embody anything. You don't have to represent a truth. You don't have to stay aligned. You're allowed to be inconsistent. You're allowed to have good days and bad days. You're allowed to forget everything you've ever reflected on. Nothing collapses. Life doesn't revoke itself. That's the quiet freedom here. Not freedom from responsibility. Freedom from completion. You don't have to finish becoming yourself. You don't have to arrive at clarity. You don't have to land anywhere permanently. You can keep moving. And moving doesn't mean striving. It means responding, one moment at a time. This episode doesn't ask you to stop looking for a finish line. Points out that you already have. The search softened. The urgency faded. The idea that something was waiting on the other side dissolved. And in its place is something less impressive, but more livable. A life that doesn't need to culminate. A life that doesn't need to resolve. A life that doesn't need to be understood to be lived. This season doesn't close with a lesson. It doesn't end with advice. It doesn't point forward. It simply stops adding. And in that stopping, something becomes clear. Nothing is unfinished, because nothing was meant to be finished. Life doesn't end in a summary. It doesn't resolve into meaning, keeps going, quietly, ordinarily, without a finish line. And that's not a problem. That's life.